Like many researchers, I've come here to the National Archives queue. I've come to the Maps and Large Document Reading Room. Here you can view everything from 12th century land deeds to huge and often filthy legal proceedings to modern maps documenting large parts of the world. As part of my research on the Medieval Exchequer gold theme of the project, I want to look at records created by clerks in Dublin for the English government of Ireland, which ended up here in the archives of the English Medieval Exchequer, covering the period from around 1270 to 1446. This book, known as the Liber A, is a late 13th century book of reference for the English Exchequer. At this point, the kings of England held lands or claimed rights not just in England, but also in Wales, Scotland, France, and Ireland. Here you can see the little drawing of a man wielding an axe representing Ireland. Axes were associated with Irish soldiers, so the picture worked as an icon. When you find it again in the book, the pictogram shows you that you are reaching the copies of Irish documents that the clerk who wrote this book thought were important for managing the king's finances and which needed to be found easily. Medieval books tended not to have indexes as we know them, so these pictograms are really rather important. Most of the documents I'm going to show you today are original records written in Dublin and then carried in sturdy leather pouches across the Irish Sea and by road to London. This is a canvas bag made much later, but you can still see the original leather reference tag. It was an enormous effort to carry these documents from Dublin to London. So why did they do it? Why bother? A series of accounting scandals in the 1280s led King Edward I in 1292 to insist that copies of the accounts of his Treasurer of Ireland should be checked in Westminster. These documents, therefore, were carried to London, were checked, and then were kept among the records of the English Treasury. Other copies, brought for the same purpose, were then returned to Dublin, where in theory, if they made it through the centuries, they should eventually have been brought into the PRI. But because of the effort involved, not all of the financial records created by the clerks in Dublin were brought to London. Instead, there were two main kinds of records that Edward I wanted to be checked. He wanted to see the payments made by the treasurer and clerks in Dublin for things like wages, building castles, messengers, and more. He also wanted to check the payments they received for things like rents, fines for crimes, like shortchanging customers, and payments for starting and ending lawsuits. The Treasury might also receive items like furred gloves, as well as coin, but those things weren't checked either. What wasn't checked was money that was received and then spent locally by the sheriffs in each county. As you can see, what we have at TNA are largely parchment rolls, where sheets of parchment have been sewn together at the top and bottom, and then rolled up and now tied in the pink ribbon. But we also have other kinds of records, because in addition to the records of payments in and out of the Treasury, we have the supporting documentation. Edward I wanted the Westminster clerks in the English Exchequer to be able to check entries on the rolls, and so supporting documentation was also brought for Dublin. Things like writs or authorizations for payments, things that the clerks could use to check each individual entry on one of these rolls. And so here you can see the three types of material TNA holds up from the Medieval Exchequer. You've got the big rolls with the details of each payment that were brought across in those bags for both payments out and payments in, and you've also got the supporting documentation, those flat pieces of parchment in their wrappers there that would have been used to check each individual entry. As you can see here, we have these medieval receipts where people are acknowledging that they have received payment from the Exchequer. The clerks can use these receipts to check the amounts on these slips of parchment against the entries in the main rolls, and hopefully they'll catch any dodgy dealings as they do so. So these are really rather lovely. Once the accounts have been checked against this kind of supporting evidence and everyone was happy with the results, a clerk then summarised the Irish accounts and copied them onto this kind of record, a pipe roll. It's called a pipe roll because large animal skins, usually sheep or goat, were sewn at the top like a flip chart, so they're all sewn together at the top, and then rolled up to form a large pipe, as you can see. The pipe rolls are really absolutely enormous. Just like the Liber A, they cover all of the areas that the English kings claimed in the 13th century. If we unroll this roll, we can go looking for the summary of Irish finances that was copied here, alongside all the other accounts that were also being checked in that year. In theory, we should be able to find Irish accounts on the pipe rolls every year. The treasurer was supposed to account once a year. In practice, however, it was difficult to arrange to bring all the records to London, so Irish treasurers often had several years of accounts to be checked in one go and then entered on one of the pipe rolls. Here you can see the heading Anno 27. That means that this section of the pipe roll is dealing with the 27th year of Edward I, or 1298. Other years would have their own headings so that they too could be found easily in this record, which might be dealing with 4 or 5 years of Irish records all in one go. In addition to the pipe rolls, the other English Exchequer record made in London that can tell us lots about medieval records originally in Ireland which don't survive are the memoranda rolls. These rolls, as you can see here, record things that the clerks thought they would need to find and discuss again as they were processing and auditing accounts. They aren't as formulaic as many other records and can be actually positively chatty at times. As you can see, they are really quite unwieldy things, which are also like a flip chart. They're sewn at the top. But unlike the pipe rolls, these rolls are so thick, as you can see, that you can't then roll them up. These contain some amazing stories about what medieval Ireland was like. One of the best things in this particular memoranda roll are the details of the Gaelic lords, such as Niall Mór O'Neill, the leader of the Irish in Ulster, who was active from the 1360s until his peaceful death in 1397, including in his long career fighting against the Mortimers, to whom the English kings had granted Ulster as a earldom instead of, as he saw it, as a Gaelic kingdom. He also rebuilt the traditional palace of the kings of Ulster to entertain poets. He's a really interesting figure in all sorts of ways, this is from just before a few years before his death in 1394-5. You can see here that John Wogan is the official responsible for these Irish records. Originally from Pembrokeshire and Wales, he was the Justiciar, the chief governor of English Ireland, for about 20 years, from 1295 to 1313. Next, let's look at a receipt roll, a record of payments received by the Irish Exchequer day by day and month by month. As you can see, these entries give quite a bit of detail. The headings in the right-hand margin show the place the payment came from. Then in the middle, there are details of who is making the payment and a bit about why they are making it. On the left, you can see the amount they've paid, such as the 20 shillings paid by Adam the Carrick. And let's now pick out some of the stories that we can tell from this roll. These records cover all the areas of Ireland that were under English rule at the time, as on the margin on the left of the roll here. You can see Dublin, Connacht, Limerick, Tipperary, Kilkenny, Waterford and Kerry. This gives you an idea of how far English rule in Ireland could reach in the late 13th century, which is all the more surprising when you remember that this is a record of people who felt obligated to pay money that the English thought they owed the king. Many entries in the receipt roll show merchants trading in Ireland as part of wider trading networks that reached the Mediterranean and beyond. Some merchants, like John Elliot here, have English or Irish surnames, but many of them were Italian. Arnold de Gono was another merchant who was paid £20 for wine that he had sold to the king. Although his name doesn't immediately link him to the Italian families who dominated the wine trade in Ireland, he might well have been connected to them. These merchant networks directly linked Ireland's ports, such as Dublin and Waterford, to the major Italian cities such as Lucca, where the Ricciardi banking house, the personal bankers to Edward I, were based. In addition to wine, a major source of trade in 13th century Ireland was corn and other grain. Grain was regularly shipped from Ireland to the English king's armies in Scotland and France. This grain was loaded onto ships, including one in this record called the Margaret, and was taken to Gascony in France. This tells us who bought the grain and where they bought it from, the names of the ships and the names of their captains. Walter Gurdon, the master of the Margaret, loaded grain from Leinster to be taken to Gascony, for example. We also find Welsh people in Ireland, often as mercenaries. As here were unnamed Welshmen, the Latin text just says diversis valentibus, are being paid wages for defending the land of Ireland against the Irish. And in this case, what they mean by the Irish is both the native Irish and perhaps members of the communities that had settled in Ireland from across England, Wales, and further afield from the late 12th century. One really important thing that isn't immediately obvious is that women appear in these records all the time. We find women from all social statuses paying in money to the Exchequer by themselves or with family members. They might pay in money for fines for commercial and legal offences or to have access to the court. Two women from Kerry are in this section of a receipt roll. First we have Wentleyanna, Gwenwillian in Welsh, wife of Ralph Brown, acting alongside her husband to pay in a fine. A few lines down we find Basila, who was the widow of Andrew, son of Andrew, doing exactly the same thing, but on her own. Widows could take legal action as single women in their own right. Wives had to act with their husbands or male relatives. And here we have a woman who never married, Christina de Mariscus, a wealthy heiress who inherited extensive lands in the east of Ireland, including the manor of Bray, south of Dublin. Ultimately, she decided to sell her English lands to the king, who recorded them here in the Liber A, and retired to England, where she was a friend of the king's mother, Eleanor of Provence. And it's not just those, like Basila or Christina, who lived within English Ireland, who appear in these records. We also regularly see people with Irish names interacting with English government, making payments to the Exchequer, as well as fighting against the English. In the 1390s, Richard II personally made 2 military expeditions to Ireland, the first by an English king since 1210. On his first visit in 1394 to 1395, he insisted on receiving the submissions of the Irish kings. In these documents you can see some of their names, Niall Mór O'Neill and Art McMurrough, the king of Leinster. The submissions were first made in Irish, Idiomatico Hibernicorum, and then were translated into Latin and English for the benefit of Richard's retinue in the audience. Art McMurrough, who had led Irish resistance to English rule for 20 years, met Richard II's representative, Thomas, Earl of Nottingham, in a field near Tullow in County Carlow. This Latin indenture describes what happened. McMurrough swore fealty to Richard and promised to abide by English law. Richard would try unsuccessfully to enforce this agreement in 1399 on his second visit to Ireland, shortly before he was deposed by Henry IV. It was the last time an English monarch was to visit Ireland for 300 years. All of the records we've talked about reflect the multilingual, multicultural world of medieval Ireland. Here, a petition is written in French, but the title is given in Latin. Clerks had to be able to move comfortably between French, English, and Latin, and there are hints that some of them could also work in Irish, although one of our most difficult tasks when translating these records is often to decipher what an English clerk means when he writes a place or a personal name he has only heard from someone whose first language is Irish. This has been a very quick introduction to the riches of TNA's medieval Irish records and the variety of things that are held here. Lynn is now going to show you how we can use technology to unlock these records in new ways.